Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back overseas. We're going to talk a little Greek politics, and it's all Greek to me, so we're going to get somebody that actually knows about this stuff. I know it's a cheap joke, but it works every time. Alex Petropoulos, another one of our great Young Voices contributors, new face to the program. Hopefully it's not the last time we see him. How are you, sir? Great to see you. Thank you for the time.
I'm doing very, very well. Thank you for having me on.
All right, let's explain to everybody the UK accent because I introduced you as Greek. You're Greek, but you lived and did university and stuff in the UK. This is not all that uncommon. Just real quick, let folks know about you and how you came to love Greek and explain it to people like me.
Yeah, so, I've got a Greek dad and I've got a very multinational mum, born in the UK, but I've grown up in Greece. So if I'm in one country, I'll call the other my home, and that's usually how it goes.
Yeah, that's how it goes. All right, you opened your piece with it. I think it's a good way to open this conversation for folks that aren't super familiar with Greece and all. Look, you can only learn so much of the ins and outs of a political system and a country's politics from afar. Greece is a little different because, we do call it the birthplace of democracy for a reason. Most of the Western tradition of culture comes out of Greece. We've all heard it in school. We've heard it over and over again. Draw me a quick line, though, ancient Greek to where we are now. I know that's a lot of human history, but what people hear historically and what we're dealing with today, there's threads there, but they're not one and the same. And this is a unique thing for the Greek people right now, right?
Yeah. So, Greece is always sort of coupled with this question of what should its democracy look like? And it's always trying to find the balance between representative democracy and proportional representation and a strong government power. When you finally decide to elect a government, you want them to have a strong mandate and to be able to actually enact their vision. And so this is a debate that's always going throughout Greek politics and Greek culture. The problem is that recently the Greek government has sort of tried to push too far on one end of this debate and tried to swing the balance in its favor in a way that is not quite illegal, but is dodgy, to say the least.
Yeah, and to be fair here and not disrespectful to anybody here, dodgy politics is a feature, not a bug. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of drama, there's a lot that goes into Greek politics. Let's back up, though, because before we get into the current situation, the recent history is really important here. There's been a lot of economic turmoil. We know about the bailouts and all that. There's been a lot of cultural turmoil. The cultural turmoil has boiled over into the political, where you have extremist groups that have tried to get power. Some of that's been abated. It's going to be an on-running problem like it is in most countries. Just give us a little bit of the background before we get into this current situation. There's been a lot going on in Greek policy the last 20 years or so.
Greece has been through an adventure, to say the least. So going back to 2010, we had, off the back of the financial crisis, we had the Greek sovereign debt crisis and all the political crises that followed, many, many elections. I remember when I was in school, it seemed like every weekend we had to stop school for Friday and Monday because there was going to be an election happening and they had to close school. But throughout all this, Greece has sort of gone through its long recession. It went through essentially a 10-year depression. And now it's coming out of that depression. And to be honest, most of the time you're going to hear stories about Greece, they're going to be really optimistic because, The Economist rated Greece as its unexpected winner of 2022, right? Of all the OECD countries, they were like, Greece, the one that impressed us the most, on the rise. And so whilst as a whole, Greece is taking 5 steps forward. At the same time, it's important to not lose sight of the steps backwards that it still takes, because there are still problems in the country. Even though corruption is at its lowest level since pre-crisis, it still only has a corruption score of 50%, which puts it at about, top 60 in the world. Not too great for an OECD country.
Yeah. Alex Petropoulos joining us. These reforms that you're talking about in your piece, we're going to link to it. Young Voices Europe, new European Bureau. We got a lot of good, fresh faces in there. You talk about it in your piece, though. These reforms that we're dealing with today, this is actually stuff from about 6-7 years ago, and it's just now taking effect. So one of our core principles in our program, things don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in a sequence. Take us back to that, the 2016 government. What happened there that it put in these new rules about supermajorities and how to change things?
Yeah. So the Greek constitution was codified a while back, And it said in that, if you ever want to change something with the election system, that can only take place in 2 elections' time, which seems like a quite decent rule. You stop governments coming in and suddenly rigging the system for their next election. So going back all the way to 2016, the left government, Syriza, came into power, dealing with all the bailout stuff. And one of their popular policy mandates was to push through fully proportional representation. So if you get 5% of the vote, you get 5% of the seats in parliament. They passed that 2016, all good. 3 years later, 2019, the center-right New Democracy government wins, and they're like, we actually prefer the old system. We're moving it back to a system that benefits us, that distills and takes away minority representation, and it pushes it to the larger parties like themselves, and it props them up artificially. So that's the history. The 2016 changes are coming into play now, this election, 2023. The issue is that they might not stay around for long.
Right, Alex Petropoulos joining us. Here's the thing with this, is just to give the other side of the argument for you to explain to folks. They're pushing this as a form of strong and stable government. That's the quote from your piece.
Yeah.
They got a point. We opened up with it. There's been a lot of chaos. There's a lot of turnover. There's been a lot of corruption, although that's better. The economic situation is better. So the argument for strong and stable has a strong argument. Of course, we're both students of history. We understand strong and stable has also been the entry-level card to all kinds of bad forms of government, because they're like, oh, well, we can't change because then accountability goes out the window. How do you balance those two things, especially in a country that's kind of finding its political footing right now? Because you do need strong and stable, but you don't want that tipping over into where you have a permanent majority, which is the fear, right?
Yeah. So to clear things up, like the principle of them deciding to change it back, if the people voted for them, that's completely fine. That's a natural and healthy functioning of us just having this balance and this swinging between strong and stable, fully proportional. The problem is the way in which they want to get about that, because what they're doing is they're essentially saying, we're going to run this one election, probably going to be in April. No one's going to get a majority. And then we're going to immediately run a second one. And what that essentially does is it takes this rule in the Constitution that says that your rules have to lag by one. They have to only apply in the second election to come. And it throws that out the window. It technically gets around it. You're just running a second election, but it really goes against the form spirit of the Constitution. And you're really just slamming through your changes far quicker than they're supposed to. So, I mean, they have their reinforced proportionality. They have their stable government for them, but it will come into play in the next election. And so the democratic thing to do is just wait for that election to come by.
Yeah. Here's the thing, too. You talk about it. Look, governments are people. People have human nature. Human nature is undefeated. You talk about it in your piece, and we're going to link to the piece. Make sure you read the whole thing. There's got to be strong incentives to get government to function properly. What are the incentives right now that are driving this? Not just the political of we want the old system. There's incentives, reasons why they want to move back and forth, right? What are the incentives right now that are pushing people to have this debate in the first place? Because it really gets to the core of why you want to change it. Because let's be honest, the next time the next group gets in power, they're going to have the same debate again, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that just means getting into the nitty-gritty of what the system is. The debate is between fully proportional representation, so 5% of the vote, 5% of the seats, or a system where out of 300 seats, you get up to a bonus 50 seats that just props up the winning party. And it essentially moves the bar from needing 50% of the vote to win a majority government down to around 39% of the vote to win a majority government. And so what this means practically is it's a question of, do you want a coalition government? Do you want to have to share power? And do you want to have to essentially trade political favors in order to get anything done? Because in previous times, that has been, you get into a coalition, and the way you get that coalition, you say, I'm going to give you the Ministry of Defense, and I'm going to give you the Ministry of Environment. And then you can end up with maybe some crazy far-right party being given the defense ministry to, satisfy their ultra-nationalistic egos or whatever, and that can have some dangerous consequences. So there are arguments to be heard on both sides, right?
Yeah, Alex Petropoulos joining us. Here we go back to this. Almost turns into a circle when you're discussing. But look, these problems are not unique to the Greeks. This is something that
No.
every government that has representation deals with. How do you deal with that give and take you're just talking about? Horse trading, we talk just the give and take of politics. Like, I'm going to give you this, you're going to give me this, we're going to compromise, and we'll get this policy in.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have that to make things work. But at the
Yeah.
same time, and you touch in it on your piece, that also gives the sitting politicians and the current leadership a very now driven focus, because it really makes them focus on the now. Good
Mm-hmm.
government has to focus past the now. How do you get past this next election? How do you get past the next 4, 6, 8 years? If you're having this argument, those things start going by the board, and the propensity is you're going to wind up with the same problem all over again, right? That's the concern.
Yeah, and I think you're really right about that long term. Because let's say you're someone who really believes in this system of strong government. The next election will, sorry, not the next, the one after next election will have that system. It's already in the law. It will just take 2 elections' time. So realistically, you could be in a position like I am, to be honest, where I think, next 4 years, maybe I'm okay with that strong, stable government to get us, really accelerate us out of the crisis and sort of grow the economy really strongly. But after that, I want proportional representation. I want them to be held accountable. And so if we want to really argue for that balance, we have to sort of say, okay, this election we'll have this system. Next election, we've got to swap. So let's vote for one party this election, have them change the election system, and then just have a new election again, right?
Yeah, Alex Petropoulos is joining us. That's the political side. That's the legislative side, the parliamentarian side. What's the appetite of the people right now? Because even though this is a parliamentarian government, so it's a little one step isolated from like what we do in America, where we throw out our Congress every 2 years for elections. What's the appetite of the people with this? Is there a little bit of weariness to the back and forth here? Is there a little whiplash from wanting to change the system back already? What's the appetite of the people right now? Because that's probably going to be the deciding factor in all this, right?
Well, I mean, for one, people, it is quite a weird effect having the delayed onset of these changes, because this is the first time Greeks will have proportional representation since 1989. So for many Greeks, they don't know what that looks like. So I don't think they're necessarily burnt out and tired of all the changes. I think that the results of this first election and then running a second could undermine the will of the Greek people for having proportional representation, because it sort of paints this picture of you can never form majorities without this strong and stable system. But at the same time, you've got to look at things through another lens, which is that the current government has been going through somewhat of a scandal and a crisis at the moment. It's sort of been dubbed by international media and local media as Greek Watergate, right? And there's this big scandal of the national intelligence agency in Greece has been spying essentially and setting up wiretaps on opposition members of parliament and also prominent journalists. And so there's been a lot of, tension within opposition parties. There have been a lot of accusations being thrown left and right. So the general air of the government isn't trying to mess us over and isn't trying to undermine democracy and democratic values. There's already a lot of subtext and pre-existing tension there.
Yeah. Let's touch on history there real quick. The subtext there is, if you go back into history far enough, you go back, to the late 60s, early 70s, the military rule in Greece. For folks that aren't familiar, that memory is fading, but that's still living memory, especially for probably a lot of the ruling class, those folks in their 60s and 70s that really have a lot of the power and the money in the country right now. That's a formative experience for them. Just real quick, for folks that aren't familiar with it, there's a reason something like that, even though corruption's a little bit better, something like a wiretapping scandal, that's why that kind of gets people's feathers up. That's just kind of an ingrained thing for that generation, right?
Yeah, it sets off alarm bells. The parallels are scary. Obviously, no one's suggesting that the government's trying to do something like what happened in the 70s with the military junta, where the military essentially took control of the government and Greece became a military controlled state for about a decade. And it was the trigger for all of the mess that happened in Cyprus. And it, I don't have to really go on to tell people why that'd be a bad thing, but it's such a core memory for so many Greek people. I mean, not for myself, because I only read about it in history books, and every year when we commemorate the atrocities of that time, we talk about it. So I guess it's polarizing for students and it's polarizing for that older class, but there's that middle gap that maybe doesn't quite remember it and doesn't quite see it the same way.
Yeah, it could be. Alex Petropoulos. Let's talk about the here and now real quick, though. That's internal Greek politics. There's a lot going on outside of Greece right now. There's the never-ending fussing with the Turks going on, which has flared up recently. You mentioned Cyprus. Cyprus is still a problem. Of course, the economic situation. Greece, like everybody else, is keeping an eye on Ukraine and Russia. That's a complicated relationship with the Greek government. What's the external stuff going on outside of this that both the Greek government and the Greek people are kind of keeping an eye on? And is that going to be unifying things, or is that going to be divisive things as this government's trying to kind of find its footing for what they're going to do electoral wise?
Yes, I mean, that's why I just finished writing up an op-ed on this, in fact, but it was going to go out, but it's been paused because of the earthquake in Turkey. And, that may end up reshifting how everyone thinks about this, because in the run up to the Turkish and the Greek elections, there's been really an elevation of tensions. But since the earthquake happened in Turkey that killed many people, the first people to call and respond and say, we're here to help, we're sending first responders, we're sending helicopters filled with medics and firefighters, was Greece, right? And so maybe this event will actually go to sort of soften tensions and ameliorate some of the concerns. That being said, maybe within a month things will be back to how they were, and then if we talk about how things were and how things will be probably in a month, we're really looking at a Greece that is aiming to redefine its geostrategic location within the world, and it's sort of aiming to fill a Turkey-sized hole in NATO, right? In the sense that Greece is becoming increasingly important for NATO in sending troops up through Bulgaria and Romania into NATO. It's becoming increasingly important to sort of act as an airbase for sort of NATO projecting its power into the Middle East. So if you look at a lot of things that the government has been doing, the Greek military budget was 2.8% of GDP in 2020. In 2021, that went up to 3.9% of GDP, then down to 3.75. So there's been a massive spending on military. So clearly the current government sort of sees itself as filling this hole within NATO in the southeast and within the southeast of the Med, and sort of aiming to sort of be the anchor state within the Mediterranean for NATO. And so obviously it has to win its next election to do that. And that maybe would sort of play into why it would want this stability, to be able to sort of, how can it call and claim to be providing stability for the south of Europe if it can't provide stability within its own form of government?
Yeah, good points. Alex Petropoulos. See, I got all the way through it, now I can't say it. Alex Petropoulos joining us. One last question, kind of put a bow on this, and you almost did it right there just in explaining that. The Greek relationship with Europe has always been complicated. It's ingrained. It's not going away. The frenemyship, we'll put it politely, with Turkey, that's not going to change anytime soon, especially with the current leadership in that country. What's the immediate future for the next few years? Because it looks like, economically, you just started out with it. The projections are the economy's improving, the corruption's down, even with this wiretap scandal, but corruption's down, so that's kind of made it a big deal. That's kind of a self-fulfilling thing.
Yeah.
What's the future of Greece the next few years? Not just the NATO stuff, but just kind of coming out of this real turbulent area. Do you think they continue to ascend, or is this going to be a plateau, or is this a peak? Where do you think we are here for the next few years?
Yeah, I think the phrase that sums it up really great is five steps forward, one step backwards. And even if you look back into 2019, that's when we started coming out of the crisis, and then COVID hit. So it's sort of been COVID ended up prolonging the crisis and prolonging the economic depression longer than it should have been. But the country is rearing to recover and is rearing to keep growing. And I think Greece is definitely going to be on the rise. I think that it will possibly need to diversify its portfolio in order to actually continue that growth and make it sustained. But I think that it has a lot of allies. There are a lot of people within Europe who sort of look at Greece and still hold this impression of broke country, can't handle its finances. I mean, as a Greek British person, I think I'm allowed to say that I think that the roles have now been reversed, and the UK now holds that crown. So take it like this: when I'm thinking about where I'd like to work over the next 5-10 years, I'm leaning more Greece than the UK. So that sort of can give you my impression of the upward trajectory that it sort of has on its path.
Yeah, and no offense to the British beaches, but much better beaches in Greece. So a little better there. Alex Petropoulos, thank you so much for the time today. Till we get you back on Hertel, though, let folks know how they can keep up with you, how they can follow you. We're going to link to your piece and all your social media. Let folks know how they can keep up with you till we get you back on Hertel again.
Yep, so I write for the Young Voices Europe blog, but I'm also a Young Voices UK contributor. So you can find me on Twitter at Alex T. Pett, and I'm writing for all sorts of publications. Got published in City AM today. So if you just follow me on Twitter, you can find all my good and bad takes.
Yep, his profile's up on the youngvoices.org page. We'll link to that. We'll definitely have you back. Important part of the world. We got to keep an eye on, a lot going on there, especially Erdogan acting funny. Greece is going to be our natural ally there. Thank you so much, Alex Petropoulos. Thank you for your time, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.